on today's World Insight with Tian Wei. Stern warning against U.S. missiles in Europe in Putin's State of the Nation address. Would the warning be heeded?
We want to restore Venezuelan democracy. We seek a peaceful transition of power, but all options are open.
And U.S. intervention in Venezuela, for better or for worse.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. We begin today's show in Moscow, where Russian President Vladimir Putin has wrapped up his annual State of the Union address. And it is the 66-year-old leader's first address to both houses of parliament since he was elected to be the fourth presidential term a year ago. Mr. Putin spent much of his speech on the domestic economy and raising people's living standards, as well as some critical security issues. Here are some highlights.
It is the Russian president's biggest speech this year. Mr. Putin delivered his annual State of the Nation address before the Federal Assembly on Wednesday. The speech focused on the domestic economy and raising people's living standards, which had been affected by Western sanctions. The president vowed to invest colossal resources on Russia's development and promised Russians better conditions within this year. Economic restrictions cost the country's economy more than $6 billion in 2018, while the EU played the biggest role in clamping down on growth. Meanwhile, real income in Russia has fallen for a fifth year in a row, leaving many families struggling to buy the most basic goods. Besides the economic challenges, the country is also struggling with complicated security problems in the past year. Mr. Putin said in his speech that Russia will develop its defense capabilities and take reciprocal measures if the United States deploys missiles.
We're not interested in confrontation, and we do not want it, let alone confrontation with such a global power like the United States of America.
Earlier this month, the president has said Russia would mirror U.S. policy by suspending its own obligations and quitting the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, an announcement Mr. Trump made in October. Mr. Putin's Middle East policy has made Russia a power broker in the region, with military progress in Syria. Russia, Turkey and Iran are guarantors of a ceasefire deal in Syria since 2016. They intend to strengthen cooperation to help the Syrian government and its armed forces, while the U.S. is withdrawing its troops from the country. This year marks the 70th anniversary of diplomatic ties between China and Russia. In his address, Mr. Putin said Russia would work on strengthening the synergy of the Eurasian Economic Union with the Belt and Road Initiative.
So what is the takeaway from Putin's State of the Nation address? Let's turn to our panelists joining us from different parts of the world. In Moscow, Alexander Lukin, a professor and director of East Asian and SCO Studies from the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Sir, it's good to see you. Also in Moscow, Mark Sloboda, an international relations and security analyst. Welcome, sir. And with us in our Beijing studio, Cui Hongjian, the director of the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome as well. I want to begin with you, Professor Lukin. The highlight of the speech, many around the world are looking at the security part. Professor Lukin, how likely that Russia will react to the U.S. possible actions? To what degree? Did the president say well and clear?
Well, actually, the security part was very short. It was only 15 minutes out of an hour and a half long speech. But he made several interesting statements. First, it is interesting that while talking about international relations, he began with Asia. This is not very usual for Russia. He began with Japan, China, Central Asia, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and only in the very end he mentioned Europe and the United States. I think it shows the dissatisfaction with relations with the West, basically. And he was talking about the medium-range missiles treaty, of which the United States is withdrawing, and he said the usual thing, as he said before, that Russia is going to retaliate, but it's not going to be first to do anything, but it will answer kind of in kind. And what Mr. Putin said, that Russia is not going to spend a lot of money.
I see.
On all these projects,
right.
military projects.
Mr. Putin warned Russia would respond to any deployment of intermediate-range nuclear weapons in Europe by targeting not only the countries where those missiles were stationed, in fact, but the United States itself as well. Let's listen in.
Russia will be forced to create and develop weapons which can be used not only towards those territories from which direct threats may be directed at us, but also towards those territories where centers of decision-making in employing rocket systems that are threatening to us.
Now, Mr. Sloboda, knowing how already the bilateral relations between Moscow and Washington developing over the past few years, what does this statement might lead to in the near future?
Yeah, I don't think it's really anything new. It's what the Russian government has been saying from as far back as 2007. He reiterated that Russia's steps will be reciprocal to everything the United States does. If the U.S. puts intermediate-range missile systems in Europe, if the European states actually allow this, Russia will reciprocate by not only targeting those systems in Europe, but also their command and control systems, be those in Europe or the United States. He also spent a small amount of time reiterating Russia's advancement in several strategic systems, nuclear, hypersonic, underwater drones, and so on. The focus on this is simply because Russia is outspent and outmatched conventionally by an aggressive United States and its NATO allies. By such a large degree, it relies much more on its strategic capabilities as a deterrent in order to defend the country. And that's the fact that Russia seems to have a leg up over its peer great power competitors in several of the systems is seen as something to highlight in order, again, to deter any aggression against Russia.
Mr. Cui, as an observer coming from China, what do you think will likely to set the tone of the relations between Russia and the United States, given what we know about intermediate range missile treaty, the two decisions made by two governments, and also the investigation going on inside Washington about President Trump, his relations with Russia? What will likely to set the tone about this relationship to you, Mr. Cui?
I think recent years, undoubtedly, this situation between Russia and the United States would be very, very big focus for not only Russian foreign policy and also for the other players for international community. We want to know what will happen really, between those two big powers. But of course now, no matter which kind of kindly message from Washington towards Moscow, so far I think that there's still a lot of structural, barriers to stop any kind of closer relations between two countries. I think for this statement that we can find out, yes, Mr. Putin showed some, a tough attitude on some big issues like the INF treaty, and also how could Russia do something to promote or to keep its status as big powers. But at the same time, I think because of so far the major focus for Mr. Putin is on a domestic, especially economic issue.
Right.
So I think this year, perhaps, Russia will try to keep a defensive, stance.
I see.
towards the United States, maybe in a more actively way.
In a what way?
In an active way.
In an active way,
yes,
meaning what?
defensive stance, but in active way.
Interesting,
for example,
that combination.
Yes, for example, I think Russia could take use of more diplomatic instruments, not some military instruments.
Let me get to
yes.
Professor Lukin, also from Russia. Do you agree with your Chinese colleagues' analysis about Russia's possible approach to the U.S. this time?
Well, I'm not sure why you're so fixed on Russia's relations with the United States. You know, I'm quite sure that the majority of people who listen to Mr. Putin did not even care about it, and foreign policy in general. The largest part of his speech was actually social policy. And this was interesting because he pledged to support families, you know,
right. Before we get there, Professor Lukin, I'm sure we have proportions of our discussion that will cover those areas, but we don't want to switch away from some important talking points, no matter how small a paragraph is it in the speech, but still significant given what we know about history and the current reality. Professor Lukin, tell me about whether Russia is thinking about relations, for example, with Asia, with quote-unquote the East, would be able to take the place that Russia has been working on in order to develop a better and closer relationship with the Europeans. Will that be able to help Russia and support Russia's agenda for years to come, whether it's economic or geopolitics? Professor Lukin.
As I said, the fact that you spoke first about Asia first and in greater detail shows that Russia is really turning to Asia. President Putin spoke about One Belt, One Road initiative and the forum where he's going to go very soon in April. The second forum of One Belt, One Road and Russian-Chinese relations. He spoke about relations with Japan, which are also not bad, and he said that Russia will try to solve differences with Japan and make an effort to sign a peace treaty. He spoke about Shanghai Cooperation Organization. As for the he mentioned Europe in the end, but he said something like that we hope that Europe is going to somehow make our relations normal again. But if they don't want, if they don't want to do it, what can we do? And the United States was mentioned the last, and you know, it's not an important issue in Russia because our trade is not significant.
I see.
Well, they are trying to kind of you know, withdraw from most treaties that we had before, but what Russia can do? When Mr. Putin said what we can do, if they're withdrawing from the arms treaties, we are going to somehow take appropriate measures, but not necessarily absolutely similar measures.
Okay, but Mr. Sloboda.
But just develop weapons which would be enough for our defense.
Okay, Mr. Sloboda. Obviously, Russia has been keeping all possibilities open by doing diplomacy proactively, as Professor Lukin mentioned over the past few years, particularly. But as you may know, when the relations with the United States went further sour, some of the countries that closely work with the United States, like the country's allies, for example, around the world, might also have a very different attitude toward Russia as a result. Whether that matters or not, that's an issue that we can debate at a time. But what about for Russia's efforts trying to have a overall approach to the other parts of the world? Will that really work? For example, recently we have heard about the cancel of trips and interactions between Russia and Israel, just to mention an example. So, Mr. Sloboda, to what extent Russia will be able to break, in a way, this U.S.-related block toward Russia?
Yeah, I mean, Russia's diplomacy is really an essential and very characteristic part of Russian foreign policy. And we've seen that most remarkably in the last year or two in the Middle East, where suddenly Middle East countries from regular United States allies, partner countries like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, UAE, and others are turning to Russia. First, for the resolvement of crises, particularly Syria, but others in the Middle East, and for the maintenance of international oil prices. But also when you have U.S. military partner countries like Turkey and NATO and Saudi Arabia, which buys enormous amounts of U.S. arms, turning to Russia to buy advanced air defense system S-400s and others, that marks a shift. That signals that Russia's foreign policy is back in the Middle East in a big way. And I think this is echoed with Russia's newfound focus on Asia, prioritized over Europe, and not to exclude Africa, its outreach to Venezuela, in South America, its support for the government, which is under siege by the U.S. there, and even business contacts in Southeast Asia. However, when it comes to the United States and Europe, Russia places the primary fault for the deterioration of these relations on the United States and its client states in Europe. And it specifically said that it has made every effort to resolve these diplomatically, and the initiative is now on the United States. Putin very specifically said, if there is a knock on the door, we will answer it. We will open the peace. But now the ball is in the U.S. court. If the U.S. wants to improve relations, that's fine. We're open to that. If they want to continue down this road, then we can play that game as well.
I see.
And that's really where Russia is I think, fed up with the United States and with relations with the West in general, and is well beyond exploring its other options.
Okay, Mr. Cui, now, the world is changing fast. We are saying it every day, and it's just so true, ever. So one of the things is you have so many moving factors going on all at the same time. Nobody knows where eventually how these moving factors eventually going to work against the for and toward together with one another. Nobody knows, but certainly China and the United States are in a stage of intense trade negotiations, apparently trade negotiations, probably more than that. And now Russia, U.S., as you can see, is changing really fast. The Europe is in the process of making its choices. Meanwhile, you see hotspot issues also have a big impact on how different factors of the world are working for, toward, and against each other. So it's a general picture. So Mr. Cui, to what extent are you looking at Russia as a Chinese scholar? And how much will that impact on China's judgment about what approach, to what degree to take?
I think so far still, I think Russia still, I mean, a very big, with a bigger potential, and I mean, as major powers in the world. And if we look at this world, even just like you mentioned, now they are full of the turbulence. But so far, if we are believing that there will be a multipolar world in the future, I think undoubtedly Russia is trying to take its role in the future world. But now the question, I think, from a perspective as a Chinese scholar, I think firstly, according to this statement by President Putin, I think it's clear that Russia is trying to, get some more economic development. I think it's very necessary to support its dream as a big power. Secondly, how could, just like our Russian guest mentioned, to get a balance between a traditional, I mean, strategic focus in Europe, in United States, and turn to a lot of towards the Asia. I think now, yes, Russia is trying to play an active role in its position in the middle of Euro-Asia region. So I think it could give us some more imagination. How could Russia and China to get some more cooperation? But of course, at the same time, I don't think even now we are, started to smell some environment of so-called new Cold War. But I do believe that if we are trying to get some more cooperation, but not in traditional bloc politics,
right.
I still believe that China, Russia, U.S., we can try to maybe this gaming between those big powers could help this maybe a new framework for the big powers.
Well, we'll see how that will be eventually coming out. But Professor Lukin, I want to go back to the point that you've been repeatedly making, that is Russia looking at the economic development. Russia is looking at the economic and, as a result of political opportunities in its neighborhood through the Eurasian Union, and also, for example, with Japan, with even Vietnam, and certainly with China. But what do you think can be achieved in short term to be able to help now a economy in Russia which is suffering still from very slow growth rate?
Well, Mr. Putin and the government are now very eager to promote so-called government projects, which are kind of big investment programs in various areas of to support various industries or even education or science and technology. And the government is trying to use a lot of money which they are trying to save by raising taxes, by the way, and also by the reform, the pension reform. They raised recently the retirement age from 60 to 65 years,
yeah,
to invest the government funds into the economy. Well, I'm not sure if it's going to work or not. Let's wait and see. But if it works, according to President Putin, we can expect growth by the year, well, in 2 or 3 years, a growth which would be higher than the medium growth of the kind of the world, of the entire world. So that would be at least like 4 or 5%. When Russia had such growth when Putin just came to power in the first decade of this century, but then it went down. So that's that's are the hopes of the government.
Mr. Sloboda, of course, it is the economy. We all understand that slogan. Russia's economy has not necessarily doing that impressive over the past few years during different terms of Mr. Putin. Will these efforts encouraging population birth rate, encouraging more social welfare, obviously bigger picture economic interlink between Russia and those countries around, will that work? Will Russians give Mr. Putin many opportunities?
Yeah, I think we've already seen some strength there, that Russia, as well as it has economic opportunities outside of the West, it's also developed a very high degree of financial independence and economic self-sufficiency. And we've seen this despite a extremely powerful and increasingly layered set of sanctions by the United States and the EU. Russia's growth has returned to growth, and it's still increasing. It had 2.3% GDP growth in the last year, in 2018, and this is higher actually than the European average, and this is despite the sanctions it's under. So I think it has developed a degree of independence that is slow growth, but it's a very high degree of qualitative growth, as it were. There is a focus on demographics. Russia's demographics, like most first world Western countries, are facing a graying phenomenon where the birth rate has dropped below the absolute replacement level. And Russia is focused on raising that. Right now it's still, again, above the European average, so it's not exactly an existential crisis relative to other developed countries in the world. But Russia is the largest country in the world by far, and it does need a higher degree of population for economic returns.
I see.
And so there's a lot of focus in Putin's speech on measures, reduced mortgage rates, subsidies, child care, and everything towards encouraging and making it possible for Russian families to have more children.
Okay, well, there are a lot of points in the State of the Nation address by Russian President Vladimir Putin. I'm sure we'll see how those policies are likely to be implemented and their final results. For now, thank you so much, the three of you gentlemen, for joining us in Moscow. Alexander Lukin, Mark Sloboda, in Beijing, Cui Hongjian. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, on CGTN. Still to come on the program. U.S. intervention in Venezuela, for better or for worse? That's up for discussion right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Now let's turn to the political crisis in Venezuela. U.S. President Donald Trump has warned Venezuela's armed forces not to risk their lives, in his words, and future by supporting President Nicolas Maduro. He urged the country's military to allow U.S. shipments of food and medicine to enter Venezuelan territory.
We want to restore Venezuelan democracy. We seek a peaceful transition of power, but all options are open.
The U.S. has accused the Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro of indifference toward his own people. But does the U.S. really care about the Venezuelans? Or is it just another ploy to undermine Mr. Maduro? Many ask that question. Here is the bigger picture.
The country is battling hyperinflation, high unemployment, and severe shortages of food and medicines. There's no denying Venezuelans need urgent help and international support. But is American aid the answer? As the United States attempts to play the Good Samaritan and blame Maduro for being insensitive, facts tell a different story. Many experts believe Washington should be partially blamed for the economic mess in Venezuela. For more than a decade, the United States has slapped sanctions as a policy tool against a Latin American country. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro says the reported $20 million worth of aid pales in comparison with the estimated loss of $30 million per day in oil revenues due to the U.S. sanctions. And it's not just Maduro who's skeptical of the assistance. Both the United Nations and the Red Cross have declined to participate in Washington's aid plan. Venezuela's opposition leader is also accused of using the aid offer as a political weapon. On Monday, Juan Guaido tweeted this picture of himself with the U.S. aid material. The Trump administration's humanity argument seems to have a few loopholes as well. Some experts blame the U.S. for conveniently ignoring the humanitarian crises elsewhere in the world. In Yemen, the U.S. is part of the Saudi-led coalition which is accused of creating one of the worst humanitarian crises in the Middle East. Late August, the Trump administration, it won't spend $230 million reserved by Congress to help stabilize areas in Syria. It also decided against spending over $200 million set aside for Palestinian aid in the West Bank and Gaza. So the question is politics the single biggest factor behind the American aid offer?
So how would the U.S. intervention in Venezuela likely pan out? Let's ask our panelists. In New York, we invited Alejandro Velasco, who is an associate professor of Latin American history at New York University. Welcome, Professor. In Washington, D.C., we have, through Skype, Michael Shifter, president of the Inter-American Dialogue. Last but not least, joining us in Caracas is Phil Gunson, a senior analyst from the International Crisis Group. We do know that none of the three panelists are actually coming or inside as Venezuelans right now, but I would love to hear different views coming from you. Professor Velasco, what about you? Will the U.S. shipments of medicines and food really looking at the Venezuelan people, or there is a political backdrop to it?
Well, I think the answer to that is both. Certainly, as your report suggested, the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela is real. Not only is it manifested in terms of shortages of goods, but also of medicines and an increasingly large exodus of people leaving Venezuela. On the other hand, it's no denying that the United States has far larger aims for Venezuela than humanitarian assistance. As your report also indicated, the amount that has been pledged already is almost risible in relation to the scale of the crisis. And so, you know, the United States, as in other places, has both, you know, legitimate claims to be assisting, but much larger, both geopolitical as well as domestic interests in pushing for this aid right now.
Mr. Shifter, of course, at the very beginning of this, it was almost the impression of regime change that Washington was aiming at. Now, as time goes by, different factors are coming into play. Mr. Shifter, do you read Washington's goal as clearly as that phrase, regime change?
Well, Washington, along with more than 50 other countries, have recognized Juan Guaido, the president of the National Assembly, as the interim president, and regard President Maduro as illegitimate. And so there is a call for a transition and for new elections. That's, I think, the kind of outlook and kind of the approach that the United States has. But the United States is certainly not alone. There is quite a broad international coalition that recognizes Guaido and regards Maduro as illegitimate. So there is, I think, pressure to have open elections, to have a new leader in Venezuela. And there's, I think there's a sort of a broad consensus. There are, of course, governments and countries who reject that. But I think what's been striking is the extent of broad international support for a transition scenario with free and open elections.
I see. Mr. Gunson, now you are based in Caracas. We understand there has been reports suggesting the Venezuelan government shutting the border, where the American shipment of medicine and food apparently have been blocked from it. So, Mr. Gunson, can you help us to understand the latest situation? What exactly is happening over there according to your sources?
Yes, the government's intention is definitely to block the border. In fact, just yesterday, they announced the closure of the sea and air frontier with the Dutch Antilles, which is a group of islands belonging to the Netherlands, which is just offshore of Venezuela, and where aid is waiting to be delivered by sea, according to the plan the opposition and the United States have spoken of. We're looking at three main points of entry, at least that have been announced. One is that northern one that I mentioned. One is on the western border with Colombia, where the bulk of the aid has been accumulating in a place called Cucuta, a Colombian town on the border. And then in the north of Brazil and the far south of Venezuela, a very uninhabited area of both countries, really, a much less active border than the Colombian one. There's also aid there. It doesn't look very likely that the bulk of the aid is going to get across on Saturday, which is the day that has been announced by the interim President Juan Guaido, or the interim president that many countries recognize. But I think some part of that aid will get through. They've split it into smaller packages, and some of it will undoubtedly get across the border one way or another.
Right. And also, Mr. Velasco, Professor, tell me about your understanding of the internal fluid situation inside Venezuela, coming from your observation, of course. You know, in a crisis, in a political crisis, different factors, whether it's the army, the economy, and its outside forces, I mean, outside influence, and also the government now in power, all working toward one another in different ways. And on a day-to-day basis, things could change. The balance could also be tipped. So what's your understanding of the latest balance from your perspective, sir?
Well, things change in Venezuela by the minute sometimes, yes. And so I would certainly defer to Phil, who is there, for greater insight on the day-to-day. On the other hand, I mean, in terms of the internal dynamics, in part, as you suggested, the military, at least certainly in the upper echelons, has shown remarkable resilience in terms of their support for Maduro in light of some of the increasing pressures announced by the United States and more directly even by Donald Trump in his speech on Tuesday. On the other hand, popular sectors who have long supported first Hugo Chavez and later Nicolás Maduro, they've shown some hesitation and increasing amounts of street protests that have been really severely repressed by the government of Maduro, showing some cracks within. On the other hand, the rhetoric, the increasingly acerbic rhetoric, which unfortunately Michael did not really sort of address, by the United States beyond the issue of an international coalition, which hasn't really spoken significantly about elections. It's really primarily spoken about an interim regime. That, I think, gives Maduro's rhetoric as to fighting imperialism much more weight among these popular sectors, right? So you have these conflicting areas where the economy, of course, is in crisis, and yet at the same time, to some extent, the boogeyman that the Maduro government has long claimed seems to have finally arrived in the guise of the United States' very vocal insistence on, let's call it, regime change.
I see. Mr. Shifter, since your name is being mentioned, let me also ask you about that similar question. Now, people are looking at this, even though there are people that subscribe to the U.S. camps, for example, about the current so-called the interim government or not, and there are other camps that do not necessarily pro to this change, internationally speaking. People are looking and observing the situation very closely every day in Venezuela. So one of the important questions is, people are also looking at history. To look at history over the past few decades, particularly U.S. presidents set in the Middle East and other places, whether these kind of regime change, whether you use the word or not, is really going to have a good impact on the country's future. So, Mr. Shifter, given your knowledge of what's going on now in Washington, is there real sophisticated thinking about all of this?
Well, sophisticated would not be the first word that comes to my mind. I think, first of all, there's a contrast between the Venezuela situation in the United States and the history. The United States is not working unilaterally on Venezuela. It's working in concert with most Latin American countries, Canada, and the major European countries. And the reason why those countries have come around, in my view, is because you have a new element in the whole situation. His name is Juan Guaidó. He's a leader that we haven't seen from the opposition over the last 20 years, who connects with a lot of Chavista sectors and people that supported Maduro at the beginning. And this is a change, I think. And so countries think that if there is a change in government in Venezuela, that there's an opposition that one can imagine has the capacity to govern, because it has a leader, it has a strategy, and it's united. But let me just say one other thing. I think that the risk of fracturing this coalition is this rhetoric from Washington and the threats and ultimatums that we're hearing from President Trump and Senator Rubio and John Bolton directed to the generals. I think it's counterproductive. That's exactly the opposite effect of what they're seeking, and it could risk fracturing the international coalition that's been forged on this. So that I'm very concerned about that, and I think that this is going to be a real problem in moving forward.
Now, when you talk about the presidents, Mr. Gunson, for all of us, it's no secret, Iraq, at the time when the war happened, you also got a lot of coalition countries standing behind the United States, but decades later, what we have seen now is not necessarily coincides with the beautiful pictures being described then. So, Mr. Gunson, the legitimate question now is, given the fact that there has not been necessarily a very successful example, what are the factors that we should look into for the future of Venezuela from your perspective, sir? Mr. Gunson, before we go.
Yes, well, I agree very much with Michael that there's this very politicized, very ideological rhetoric coming out of Donald Trump in particular. He's talking about rolling back socialism and regarding this and presenting this as if it was a purely U.S. operation. I think that does risk forcing the military and civilian elements of the Maduro government closer together rather than fracturing them. And I think that there's a big difference between a transition and what you've been calling regime change. It's very important to note that the European side of this, the EU's proposal, has to do much more with the emphasis on agreeing a procedure for free and fair elections than it does to do with military pressure or even this pressure through humanitarian aid. And I think it's very important that there should be some kind of agreed transition, because I think the future, you mentioned Iraq, and of course Iraq turned into a very messy case after the US intervention there. If there isn't an agreed transition, then I think the future stability of Venezuela, the governability of Venezuela, and the internal security, not to mention the economy, is likely to be severely compromised. So I would favor looking much more at the EU's contact group, its international contact group, and that kind of framework for a negotiated transition.
All right, we are running out of time for this round of a discussion. And a final note before we go is that different governments around the world are having very different views about what the U.S. and the countries behind the United States are trying to do in Venezuela. That's just a footnote. But for now, thank you so much, the three of you gentlemen, for joining us for this round of discussion and sharing your insights and views. Really appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.